By April 1945, the world that had once trembled before the relentless advance of Hitler's armies was now witnessing their total and irreversible collapse. The architect of the promised thousand-year Reich, the man who had commanded the grandest stages of Europe, was now reduced to hiding deep underground in a damp, concrete subterranean bunker beneath the ravaged, burning streets of Berlin. For years, the entire regime had sustained itself on the powerful myth of the Führer's destiny, systematically dismissing every catastrophic defeat and setback as temporary. His ministers had continuously assured the populace that the will of the Führer remained unbreakable. Yet, the grim reality told a different story. That was profoundly shattered. Above them, Berlin was consumed by fire, the relentless shelling of the advancing Red Army echoing just a few miles from the city center. Inside the claustrophobic Führer bunker, no natural light penetrated. Only the weak, erratic flicker of dying electric lamps cut through the oppressive haze of cigarette smoke and the palpable stench of fear. Maps still hung on the walls, covered in defiant red arrows detailing imaginary counterattacks that would never materialize. His highest-ranking generals desperately urged him to escape the capital of the Bavarian Alps, offering a chance to regroup and continue the fight, but Hitler responded with furious disbelief. Surrender was an impossibility. To the dictator, any form of retreat represented the ultimate humiliation, a fate far worse than defeat itself. Behind those cold, distant blue eyes, a terrible recognition was finally dawning. For the first time in his life, Adolf Hitler grasped the shattering reality. His world, the vast empire he had forged, his absolute control, the very myth of the invincible Führer, all were irrevocably gone. The first seismic fracture appeared not on the front line, but within his inner circle, when Hermann Göring, his once loyal deputy, transmitted a calculated message suggesting he assumed command of Germany should Hitler become isolated in Berlin. While this was a pragmatic contingency for a leader facing encirclement, Hitler interpreted the move as the deepest form of betrayal. He erupted in paroxysms of fury, denouncing Göring as a traitor and immediately ordering his arrest. Yet, the rage masked the terrifying truth. Even his most trusted confidants had abandoned the belief in ultimate victory. By this catastrophic late stage, every major German city lay in ruins. The Western Allies pressed relentlessly from one flank, the Soviet armies from the other. The invincible Reich was now surrounded, starved, and strategically divided. Still, Hitler fiercely maintained an impossible delusion. He clung to the notion that the so-called Steiner counterattack, a final, desperate thrust led by General Felix Steiner, would somehow crush the Soviets and save Berlin. It was an order born purely of fantasy. Steiner never received the necessary troops, and the attack was never launched. When his demoralized staff finally informed him that General Steiner had failed to mobilize Hitler, the facade of infallibility finally fractured. Eyewitness accounts detail a man utterly consumed by defeat. Witnesses described him shaking uncontrollably, his fists hammering the conference table in raw, desperate fury. He unleashed a torrent of accusations, screaming that the war was irrevocably lost and that his generals had orchestrated a catastrophic, deep-seated betrayal. This was the infamous Führer bunker meltdown, a moment of truth that indelibly marked the minds of even his most fanatically loyal officers. The illusion of final victory was now completely shattered. For the first time, Adolf Hitler articulated the chilling words his subordinates had long dreaded. The war is lost. He abruptly dismissed the room. Upon their return, the manic rage had evaporated, replaced by a terrifying stillness. His voice was subdued, his face drawn, pale, and almost spectral. The rhetoric of destiny and Germanic glory was silenced. He spoke only of his impending end, informing them that he would remain confined to Berlin and, when the moment arrived, take his own life. The man who had once commanded an entire continent now sat isolated, trembling in the subterranean shadows, his gaze fixed blankly on the floor. Within the oppressive concrete confines of the bunker, the atmosphere grew suffocating, weighted by the crushing finality of history. Outside, the relentless sounds of the closing battle intensified, the grinding tracks of Soviet tanks and the deafening concussions of approaching artillery. The relentless artillery fire announced a final, desperate collapse. Soviet forces had already penetrated deep into the city center. Berlin was not merely under siege. It was a maelstrom of destruction, a sea of flames where desperate civilians fled through choking rubble. Amidst this apocalyptic scene, SS officers frantically incinerated incriminating documents, while barely shaving adolescents, the final, tragic levy, were deployed to defend streets that had structurally ceased to exist. Hitler's monolithic world, meticulously constructed upon a foundation of fear, iron discipline, and relentless lies, was now dissolving at a speed he could no longer fully grasp. This was more than just a military defeat. It was a shattering of his self-forged identity. For years, Nazi propaganda had mythologized him as the man chosen by destiny, but as the walls of the Führer bunker shuddered from the concussions above, even Hitler began to entertain the terrifying possibility that fate had utterly abandoned him. He frequently sought solace in the corner of his desk, where a portrait of Friedrich the Great rested, the Prussian king who, centuries prior, had salvaged victory from the brink of total defeat. He stared at this image, maintaining a desperate vigil for a miracle that would never materialize. By mid-April, the grim report sealed his isolation. His closest associates were deserting the sinking Reich. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was secretly attempting to broker peace negotiations with the Allies. Joseph Goebbels was collapsing into emotional despair, and Hitler's once loyal cadre of powerful generals was demonstrably failing. The once mighty Wehrmacht had collapsed entirely, its soldiers either dead, captured, or scattered in frantic, chaotic retreat. The Führer, who had commanded the destinies of millions, now reigned over a shrinking, suffocating domain, a handful of terrified secretaries and demoralized staff, entombed deep within the concrete labyrinth of the Führer bunker, a tomb of his own making. Then came the final, undeniable signal of doom. Reports confirmed that Soviet assault units were within blocks of the Reich Chancellery grounds, and the constant, seismic thunder of Red Army artillery now echoed relentlessly through the subterranean tunnels. The end was no longer a distant strategic possibility, nor a rumor circulated by panic aides. It was a visceral, physical presence, felt in vibrations shuddering directly above his head. He knew intellectually that there would be no escape, no 11th-hour victory, and no redemption for catastrophe he had wrought. But the moment of true, crushing realization did not occur during a frantic military briefing or a desperate command session. It came in profound silence. Retreating to his private quarters, he closed a heavy steel door and confronted his reflection. Staring back was not the conquering Führer, nor the envisioned master Europe, but a ruin, an old, broken man waiting for execution. The mirror revealed pale skin, hands that perpetually trembled, and eyes that were no longer filled with a manic, defining fury, but instead held a terrifying, hollow emptiness. Adolf Hitler, the man who had once promised the world a new order, now resembled the spectral ghost of his own catastrophic creation. Even facing absolute defeat, Adolf Hitler sought to choreograph his final exit, attempting to exert the ultimate control over his legacy. Unable to secure victory, he was determined to dictate the manner of his demise. Driven by an overwhelming fear of posthumous humiliation, specifically the ignominious public displays suffered by Mussolini, he issued chilling instructions. All potentially embarrassing records were to be incinerated, and his remains utterly destroyed immediately following his death. Outside the concrete shell of the Führer bunker, the Soviet Red Army was relentlessly storming Berlin, street by gutted street. The once proud German capital had devolved into a smoking, skeletal wasteland. The sounds of tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers echoed through the ruins. Each deafening explosion a tangible countdown to the collapse of his 1,000-year Reich. Inside the subterranean tomb, the final degradation was palpable. Scarcity ruled. Food stores dwindled, water pressure failed, and vast sections of the complex were plunged into darkness. As despair settled, secretaries wept quietly, some preemptively choosing cyanide capsules over the horrors of Soviet capture. Even in these last hours, Hitler's paranoia and cold cruelty manifested. He used his beloved German shepherd Blondie to test the efficacy of the suicide poison, confirming its fatal speed. This final, callous act defined the moral void that consumed the dictator. Word count, 161 words. Deep within the Führer bunker, the ruler was consumed by a paranoia so profound he preferred the certainty of death to betrayal of loyalty. By April 29th, the crackling radio waves delivered the definitive, final humiliation. Benito Mussolini, the Duce, Hitler's closest ideological ally and mirror in fascist Italy, had been captured and summarily executed by Italian partisans. The report detailed the horrific spectacle, his body mutilated and publicly displayed. Hitler fixated on the dispatch for a prolonged, silent period. Finally, his voice barely audible, he articulated his chilling resolve. "I will not suffer Mussolini's fate." This pronouncement marked a critical psychological turning point. Death was accepted, not as a consequence of defeat, but as the ultimate, final assertion of control. He alone would dictate the precise moment the Third Reich ceased to exist. That same night, he proceeded with the marriage ceremony to Eva Braun. Far from a union of affection, it was a grim, bureaucratic ritual, the desperate assertion of normalcy before the inevitable collapse. They raised a toast with meager champagne as Soviet artillery rounds violently shook the subterranean complex. Witnesses recalled Hitler's demeanor as unervingly calm, polite, and strangely distant, the internal tempest seemingly extinguished. Yet, beyond the flickering light of that small room, the war had reached its conclusion. The relentless Red Army had breached the government district, and the sound of continuous gunfire echoed relentlessly through the ruins above. The final, desperate echoes of the Reich were sounding across the shattered city. Above, German soldiers were surrendering or dying in the streets, the army that once enforced Israel had dissolved. Adolf Hitler was left with no fortress, no defense, only the damp confinement of a subterranean bunker beneath Berlin that had ceased to function as a capital. When his inner circle finally entered the private chamber, they found the scene of the suicide. Hitler was slumped upon the sofa, a pistol still loosely gripped in his hand, though the immediate cause of death was the crushed cyanide capsule found nearby. Beside him lay Eva Braun, her own life extinguished by the poison. The dictator who had so ruthlessly ordered the deaths of millions across Europe could not, in the end, face the consequences of his own crushing defeat. Following his explicit instructions, the few remaining loyal guards carried the remains up to the emergency exit and into the Chancellery Garden. As Soviet artillery continued its relentless pounding of the government district, the bodies were drenched in fuel and incinerated beneath the grim, gray Berlin sky. The 1,000-year Reich, the empire that had stretched from the Atlantic shores to the Volga, was finally reduced to a few feet of smoldering ash. Days later, when Soviet reconnaissance troops finally penetrated the subterranean complex, they discovered a scene frozen in the chaos of final collapse. Scattered documents, half-eaten rations, and desperate, scribbled notes coating the walls. The atmosphere was thick with the stench of smoke, sweat, and lingering fear. In the very room where Hitler had ended his life, the air remained profoundly heavy, a palpable residue of history, refusing to settle. The final days unfolded beneath the perpetually gray Berlin sky, precisely as Hitler had dictated. Above the subterranean complex, the relentless percussion of Soviet artillery hammered the collapsing city. The vast empire, once envisioned to stretch unchallenged from the Atlantic shores to the Volga, was now reduced to a few feet of concrete and pulverized ash. When Soviet reconnaissance teams finally breached the Führer bunker days later, they encountered a tableau of desperate decay. Maps lay strewn across tables beside half-eaten rations, while the walls bore the frantic, final scribbles of desperate men. The atmosphere, thick with the stench of smoke, sweat, and profound fear, hung heavy, especially in the chamber where the dictator had taken his own life, a scene where history seemed to pause in silent judgment. Following the surrender of Hitler's personal guard, the city of Berlin fell completely on May 2, 1945. Within a week, the regime known as the 1,000-year Reich, a grandiose fantasy of eternal dominance, was extinguished. It had endured for barely 12 years. Yet the narrative of his demise immediately became shrouded in myth. In the months that followed, rumors spread like wildfire across Europe and the globe. Hitler had escaped, perhaps to the anonymity of South America. For a populace reeling from defeat, this fantasy offered a psychological escape, easier to digest than the grim truth that their Führer had abandoned them, having first abandoned reality itself long before the final collapse. The true moment of defeat was not confined to that bunker, nor was it merely when the Allied armies finally converged. The true demise of the Third Reich was not sealed by the crossing of the Rhine or the final Soviet storming of Berlin. Its fate was determined years earlier, at the precise moment its architect, Adolf Hitler, embraced a profound delusion of his own historical infallibility, the conviction that destiny itself could not betray him. The subterranean confines of the Führer bunker merely served as the final, claustrophobic stage for the collapse of that catastrophic illusion. While the capital was engulfed in flames above, millions of lives across the continent lay irrevocably shattered. Entire families were broken, historic cities systematically reduced to ash, and generations were burdened by the indelible scars of a conflict born entirely from a megalomania of a single man who deemed himself superior to objective reality. History's ultimate judgment of Hitler rests not upon the fleeting spectacle of his empire or the fervor of his rallies. It focuses instead on profound silence that descended afterward, the desolate quietude of a ruined city, the oppressive stillness within a deep bunker, and the chilling realization of a dictator whose hateful creation could not survive him. The promised thousand-year Reich did not conclude with a climactic battle. It was extinguished by the solitary, definitive echo of a gunshot in the darkness, marking the violent, self-inflicted end of the man who presumed he could rewrite human fate. In that harrowing moment, the world was finally afforded a collective, exhausted breath as the nightmare was concluded.